to hear about what we're doing at Visceral Games. So I didn't want to get up here and do the kind of typical presentation, just talking about the game. I figured as players and knowing what it's like to be a fan of video games, sometimes it might be interesting to learn a little bit about what their journey was to kind of get into video games. So I was going to do a little talk about my life in video games. So I'm the general manager at Visceral Games in Redwood Shores, California for Electronic Arts, but I'm also the executive producer for Battlefield Hardline. So I wanted to kind of start out when I was really young, because I think I had a kind of interesting childhood. So I grew up in an area called Sunnyvale. I don't know how many of you have heard of Sunnyvale, but it's relevant for video games because that was kind of the birthplace of video games. That's where Atari came from, and in 1972 they released Pong, which was the first arcade video game. And without going into details about how old I am, I actually got a version of Pong my dad brought home when I was about 5 years old in 1975. He brought home a home version of Pong, which was like the very first video game console you could ever get. And that was a big influential moment in my life because I realized I really liked this thing, and it was cool, and it had like 2 knobs so you could play with your friend. But you know, I was little, I was like 5, and I didn't really, my brother and sister were much older than me, so I didn't have anybody to play with. So I actually played by myself. So I'd play Pong by myself. I'm 5 years old on this little crummy black and white TV I had. But at that point, I knew that there was something really cool about these games, this video game thing, and I was really intrigued by it. So then, you know, about around the same age, I used to play with action figures like G.I. Joe, or I guess it'd be Action Man for you folks out here, and Army Men. And one of the things that was different about when I would play with them, and I'm sure some of you have had this experience, I'd be playing with my friends, and they'd say, okay, my guy got your guy, he's dead. And I just didn't understand that thinking. I'm like, why? Why? Because you said you shot my guy? That's not fair. Why don't we make a game out of it? So at about, you know, around 6 years old, I started thinking about games and game rules. And so, you know, at that young age, I decided, you know what, I'm going to take these dice from my Monopoly game, and instead of you just saying that your guy got my guy, I'm going to roll these dice. And if I get an even number, my guy shot your guy. If I get an odd number, your guy shot my guy. And that was kind of the beginning of me trying to, I guess, design video games. And it just came out of playing with my friends. And it was just something that kind of naturally happened. So from there, I kind of evolved even further into games and got into Dungeons and Dragons. And again, it's just all about rules, and it really fascinated me, the attention to detail and the way people crafted and created this experience and the imagination it took to actually define these game worlds that people would play in. And again, I was kind of young, so I didn't really get all the math and everything that was going on there, but I knew that there was something there that was special, and there was something there that I really liked, whether it was the idea of being a wizard or fighting a goblin or whatever it was. There was something that intrigued me, and I think what was important about it was really imaginative, and it really got me just thinking about things that I couldn't do in my regular life, and it was really exciting for me. And so I really kind of immersed myself in that type of stuff, which kind of was cool. So right around that time, video games really started taking off. So I don't know how many of you remember the Atari 2600, but in about 1978, Atari, again, that company from Sunnyvale that was right down the street from my house, released this console that literally changed the world at the time. People started actually engaging with video games in a more serious way. And they were experiencing different types of adventures. You went from Pong, that was just basically a simulation of tennis, if you think about it, to something that actually started telling stories and creating worlds, whether it was in a game like Adventure or even some of those classic ports they did like Defender and Pac-Man. There was something else there besides just the simplicity of where we started with Pong. And that really interested me. And so around the same time, I started bugging my parents because, well, I wanted an Atari 2600. And a lot of my friends had Atari 2600s. But my dad, who was an engineer, who actually gave me that Pong system back in 1975, he wasn't buying it. He didn't want to get me this Atari 2600. He thought it was just games, it was just for fun. There was nothing you were going to do or learn from this thing. So I quickly realized that I could figure out another way for him to get me a video game console. And I asked him for this thing called an Odyssey 2. I don't know how many of you remember the Odyssey 2, but there's a picture of it right there. And under the impression of that actually being a computer of some type, because it had a keyboard, my parents actually got me that Odyssey 2. And so I used it. I actually got like a little program that was supposed to teach me how to program that I actually never really used. But I had the console. I could play games on it, and the games were cool, and maybe, not the same as the Atari games, but they were different. And so I started playing a lot of Odyssey games, and again, just getting immersed more and more about what made those games fun, and started seeing different similarities to some of the Dungeons and Dragons things come in. There was this game called Quest for the Rings that was like a combination of board game plus video game that was super cool that I was really pumped about. But those systems were kind of limited. So the next thing that happened was, Commodore came out with this computer that was going to have 64K of memory, this thing called the Commodore 64. And again, my dad came home one night with this Commodore 64. And again, my dad had the best intentions, and I think ultimately he really, helped me out quite a bit. But he brought it home for me to learn with this thing. And he put it down on my desk and said, okay, this is a computer. You can learn how to program. So again, he got me this programming program and sat me down at the computer, and I quickly realized I could play games on it. So I just started playing more games on it. And as you do, just spent way too much time doing that. But the same time that was all going on, I had a best friend who was a really, really creative guy. And we had a lot of similarities. We shared a lot of interests in the same thing. This was when I was about 8 years old, 9 years old. And we liked the same band. We were into Kiss. And that was like our favorite band when we were 8. And we also liked horror movies a lot, which was kind of weird for us being 8 years old, but we were really, really into horror movies. And this friend of mine was like a tremendous artist, and he would, draw these little comics of us and do all these really creative things. And one day his mother got him a Super 8 camera. And so he decided we were going to start making horror movies. So he actually filmed me as the star because he was the director and producer, and I was the talent, I suppose. But in our own little horror movie, and it was silly. It was about a giant snail. And you can't imagine how dumb it was. But again, it was another exploration into something that would actually wind up being really relevant in my life later. So Fangoria was a big piece of that. That was a magazine that came out about that time that was like all about horror movies, and we were really, really into that. So fast forwarding a little bit, I talked about my interest in music, and I was really into Kiss for a while. But when I got to be 9 years old, I started liking punk rock. And I actually liked a lot of the bands from over here. I was a big fan of the Sex Pistols, the Buzzcocks. There are a lot of great bands from the UK that were punk rock bands. So when I was about 13, I started actually playing in bands and was a musician. And I remember the very first band I ever recorded anything with actually wound up being on the radio in our college town, which was cool. But as I went through high school, I continued to have an affinity for music and video games. And I started this other band called No Use for a Name. So what was cool about that was it was a punk band, so it was very much like a do-it-yourself kind of attitude. And we were doing this music because it was cool. It was fun, it was fast. It wasn't very popular at the time, but we really liked it, and I could get together with my friends and play music and just have a great time. So what was weird about it was it actually started getting really popular, and our band actually started taking off. And there was a distinct moment in my life, right around when I was 18 years old, when I was in high school, where I'd been spending all this time playing video games. I was okay at school. I wasn't great at school or anything. But the music was what I really, really liked. And my parents were not super into the music thing. They thought it was a waste of time. I was just, I wasn't going to get anything out of it. And so I was at this point where, I either had to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up, which at that point, I wasn't even really clear on what a video game developer was, because if you think about it, earlier there were, a couple of people were making these games, and right around the time I was 18, we had the Genesis and Super Nintendo. So games were starting to get more popular, but again, I was, really into my music at the time. So I decided, kind of silly decision on my part, to talk to a recruiting officer from the Marines. And I was thinking, well, you know what, maybe I'll just, join the military. And, my dad was in the Army, and maybe that would be a good thing to do. And so I talked to this recruiter. And this Friday night, I played a gig with my band. And right before that show, we had sent kind of a demo tape out to some record labels. And I remember getting home, or actually waking up that Saturday morning after that show. It was pretty late. And the phone rang, and it was this guy from actually a band from England called the UK Subs, who called and asked me, he said, "Hey, are you Steve?" I said, "Yes, I'm Steve." "Hey, my name's Nicky Garrett. I run a record label called New Red Archives." I was like, "Cool, awesome, nice, so what's up?" And he said, "Well, I got your demo tape, and I really, really liked it." And I was like, "Oh, really? Cool, awesome, that's great. So what else?" And he said, "Well, I want to put out a record for you guys." And I was like, "Really? Wow, that's awesome." And at the time, this was, again, dating myself, this is when CDs came out. So the next thing he said was, "Not only am I going to do an album for you, but we're going to do a CD." I was like, "Wow, no way, you're going to do a CD and an album? Can it be like a gatefold album that like opens up, and can it have like white vinyl?" And he's like, "Sure, you can have all that." And then I asked, "Can it have a cassette?" He said, "It can have a cassette." I was like, "Awesome, this is great. I can't wait to call the guys. I'm going to call the guys right now." So I hung up the phone. Right when I hung up the phone, that Marine recruiter called me up. He said, "Hey, Steve, this is Sergeant Acosta. I'm going to come by and pick you and your friend up so you can come on down here and sign up for the Marines." I was like, "Yeah, about that, Sarge. I'm not going to go do that. I just got this record label deal thing." He's like, "Oh, really? Well, that's too bad. Good luck." And he just hung up on me. So kind of dodged a bullet there. I almost went and joined the military, but I didn't. I continued doing this band, No Use for a Name. So at that point, it was, again, not like this giant band, but it was pretty cool for me because, I liked the music. It was fun. I could show my parents I was doing something that I loved. And I think that was the big thing for me, to do something you love, something you're passionate about. So I kept playing in the band. And I wound up doing 5 albums with the band. I toured the world with them. I did about 5 European tours, went to Australia. The Punters Club, where that flyer's from, is actually where AC/DC played their first show. And had a lot of fun, got to meet a lot of interesting people. But as I was doing that, I also realized that, playing music is awesome, but I probably need to do something where I'm going to start making, a living so I can, kind of make money. Not that making music wasn't a ton of money, but the idea was I needed to do something else. Music wasn't a ton of money. It was just for fun, really. So I started going to engineering school to be an audio engineer. So I would record bands, and I would record commercials and things like that at the recording studio. So as I continued playing music, one of the tours I was on was called the Vans Warped Tour. And that went all over the U.S. With a variety of different bands. And what was cool was they had this tournament during the tour in this game called NHL 95 that Electronic Arts made. And EA was, down the street from my house. It was about probably 17 miles away from where I lived. So it was cool. Like, they came on the tour. They had this giant tournament. There were like 20 bands on this tour with us. And they had this big tournament. And I wound up winning the tournament. And it was this EA thing. So I was pretty excited about that. I got a TV, got another Sega Genesis, got a bunch of games, and it was pretty neat. But, music was cool, but I kind of, again, as I talked about, needed to start thinking about what I was going to do beyond music. So I started working at a place called Crystal Dynamics. So about the time I finished playing music, I was going to start working at a recording studio that Sega had, and I'd been interviewing with them and wanted to get in there to do recording. They actually had a music label. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but they had a record label of their own, and I wanted to go there and record music for them. And as I was waiting, I got a call from a place to do a focus test. And I didn't really even know what that was. They're just like, come down here, play this game for an hour, and we'll pay you $100. And, just give us your feedback. So I was like, awesome. So I just went down there. I loved video games. Was still playing tons of games. And I went down there, and I actually did this focus test for this game called Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. And I loved it. I thought it was a really cool game. It was about vampires, and it was totally different, something I'd never seen before. It was on PlayStation 1. The graphics were amazing, and I was really into it. And at the end of the focus test, one of the people came out and just said, hey, you had some really interesting comments about the game. Would you be interested in maybe working at Crystal Dynamics? And I was like, well, I'm kind of waiting for this other job right now, but what would I be doing? And they're like, well, you could come in and start testing games. I said, wait a minute, I could come test games? They're like, yep. Would I get paid? Yep. I was like, sign me up. Why not? So I went to Crystal and I started testing video games. And I was actually one of the lead testers on Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. That was the first video game I ever officially worked on. So that was really cool. But I guess I talked a lot, and I had a lot of ideas, and people in the studio kind of started to know who I was and started kind of talking about me, and I hoped it was in a good way. And one day, the audio director from the studio showed up in my little office at the studio, and he said, hey, I heard you're an audio engineer. I said, yep, I know how to do that stuff. And he said, well, would you be interested in maybe working on the sound for the games? And I was like, yes, I would be interested in doing that. And so he asked me to put together a little demo reel. So I went home that night, I made this demo reel of just, sound score and sound effects and, the whole bit. And I brought it and I gave it to this guy, and he was just blown away, which was awesome. He was like, I can't believe you made this in like a night. I'm like, yeah, it's no big deal. There you go. So he was really into it, and I started working in the audio department. So I was basically doing sound design for the video games. So I did sound design on Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, a game called Pandemonium, basically a bunch of games at Crystal Dynamics for about 4 years. And it was cool because I was using this thing that I actually went to school for, because I went to school to learn about audio engineering, and it was still, involving, music. And it was video games, so it was like this perfect combination of these things that I really, really liked. So I loved the work, and I worked really, really hard. And I kind of eventually wound up being the audio director at the studio. And that was really satisfying and really fun, and I got to work with a lot of different people. But the piece that I liked the most was when I got to hang out with the development team that was actually making the levels at the time, or the characters. Because they would come, I'd come sit in their cube, and we'd talk about what they wanted sound-wise, and, I would then kind of create the list of stuff we were going to do. So if a character needed to make a sound when he attacked something or got hit, I would be writing that out, and then I would go and create that sound for the game. And it was just really exciting to talk with the designers and kind of just talk about more of the design of the game, not just the sound design. So the next step for me was, I kind of told the people at the studio, I love being the audio director. It's awesome. It's totally cool. But what I really want to do is have more influence over the game. I want to run a game. And they kind of looked at me and said, well, you'd have to start as a producer of some type. I was like, okay, cool. All right. So I started as an associate producer. And the very first game I worked as a producer on was a game called Walt Disney World Quest Magical Racing Tour. That was my first shot as a producer. And it was on Dreamcast, which is pretty cool. It was actually a really fun kart racing game. But it wasn't about Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck. It was actually about Walt Disney World. So what that meant was we had to create a game where basically the attractions were the big Disney thing. And so we made a bunch of levels and tracks about like Space Mountain and Splash Mountain and all these like attractions at the park. And we kind of got the second level of characters. We got Chip and Dale and Jiminy Cricket. So, but it was fun, and it was actually a really good game, and a lot of people liked it. It was on, like I said, Dreamcast. It had 4-player split screen. It was pretty cool at the time. So that was my first production job. But around that time, as you guys might remember, is when the internet really started having an impact on gaming. So consoles, the Dreamcast for one, started allowing you to play games online. And I was really interested in that. I thought that was like the next evolution of gaming, like being able to play with your friends and share stuff that you do and kind of have that experience that I had when I was a little kid playing with my army men or playing Dungeons and Dragons. Now you could kind of do it, sitting on your couch playing a video game. So I really liked that. And I went to the head of the studio at the time at Crystal, and I said, hey, what are we doing with online stuff? I want to make an online game. Let's make an online game. And the fellow looked at me and he said, well, Steve, I don't know if there's a future in that. Yeah, we're going to kind of stick to doing the kind of games we do right now. And I kind of looked at him and I was like, what? Like, are you kidding? There's awesome games like Ultima Online and, EverQuest, I think, just came out, on PC, which was more of the hardcore stuff at the time. And, I was just like, you're kidding. We have to make these games. And he said, no, we're not going to do these games. So that was disappointing. And I decided, I was gonna go make those games. So I was gonna make one of those games no matter what. So a friend of mine that I had actually worked with at Crystal called me and said, hey, Steve, do you want to come work at Electronic Arts? And I was like, are you kidding? Of course, I love Electronic Arts. I used to play all their games when I was a kid. I won this, TV, and I won this contest with EA, and I love Madden. I used to drive up to Electronic Arts to get the games the days they came out. That was when it was smaller, of course, but I used to just show up and the shipping guy would hand me the cartridge. So I really, really liked EA. So I went to EA. And the first game I ever worked on at EA, I don't know if any of you remember this game. Be cool if you did, but it was a game called Majestic. And it was an online game. So again, I went there to make online games, and I got put on this thing called Majestic. And it was way ahead of its time. There was nothing like this game. Basically what it was kind of a combination of the X-Files meets the real world. So you would play this game on your computer, and you would install, you'd have Instant Messenger running, and you would get messages from these bots. So at the time, when you were playing the game, you thought you were talking to real people, but they were these bots. And the game actually would call you on the telephone, and the game would fax you. So that was kind of weird. I know it's a really long time ago, but it would fax you stuff. And it would send you links to these web pages. And you'd go to these web pages, and it would be the story of the game, and you would solve these basically mysteries by playing the game. So you'd be talking to these AI characters in your chat box, and you'd be talking to other players that were playing the game, and then you'd be getting these crazy phone calls, and you'd be getting faxes and stuff. So it was very, very different. So it was a big deal. It was in a bunch of magazines, and a lot of people knew about it. And unfortunately, we released the game, and like literally a month later, 9/11 happened in the United States. And people decided they didn't want anybody calling them up, screaming at them on the phone about bombs going off. So the company decided that we would not make that game anymore. So we kind of sunsetted that game. It was very sad, but understandably at the time, it was kind of scary for people to get these panicked phone calls talking about conspiracies and things like that. So that game went away. But then I transitioned into working on other games at EA. So I worked on the Tiger Woods series for a while, which was a lot of fun. And then I worked on several movie-based games, most notably Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, which at the time a lot of people thought was one of the cooler movie-based games. And that was a lot of fun. And then I worked on From Russia with Love, with a bunch of people at the company. And those games were cool. I had a lot of fun. But, Tiger Woods, Lord of the Rings, From Russia with Love, those were all licensed games. It wasn't really making, something new and something different. And that's when Dead Space started. So when the Dead Space franchise started, I was the senior producer in charge of all of the horror moments in the game. So going back to what I talked about earlier, being a fan of horror movies, making my own little silly horror movies, and reading about horror movies, I got this job to go make all the horror stuff in Dead Space. So I produced that stuff. I sat with the designers and the audio team and constructed, this is where we want this sound to happen, this is where we want this thing to jump out, this is how the lights need to look. I produced all that stuff, and it was kind of a combination of the experience I had working with audio, but also kind of the passions I had with horror and, of course, with gaming. So it was pretty exciting. So on that game, I was in charge of the horror stuff. And I also worked on what we'd call our focus moments. So the bigger moments in the game, the set piece moments, I produced those as well. And that was great fun. And when we shipped that game, we founded our new studio name, which was Visceral, Visceral Games. Well, after Dead Space, I wound up being the executive producer for Dead Space 2. And in that role, I kind of oversaw the whole project. So I finally kind of got to that point that I talked about when I was at Crystal, where I wanted to kind of run a project. But what as I kind of grew up and matured, I started realizing that no project. And so now that I was the executive producer, kind of like the head honcho guy, I realized, hey, you know what? It's all these other people that are really the most important people. They're the people that actually make this thing awesome. I'm just here to help make decisions and help guide them in the right direction. So on Dead Space 2, I got to do that, and it was totally awesome, and it was a lot of fun. So we did that, and then we moved into Dead Space 3, where we did more of that stuff, but we started trying different things. We added co-op. We did a whole bunch of different stuff. And that was kind of an end of an era for our studio, because I'd actually worked on 4 Dead Space games by this time. We did a Wii game as well. And as you can imagine, that's almost 8 years of your life. So a lot of people were anxious to try something new, try something a little bit different. So we finished up Dead Space 3, and bringing it back to the earlier stuff, while we were doing that, we got to do a bunch of stuff again, like things that I loved when I was a kid. We made action figures. We had people that would cosplay for the game. We had comics. We got a lot of cool stuff, and that stuff all happened because of people like you that were excited about that particular franchise, and it gave us an opportunity to kind of do what everybody that makes games wants to do, and that's kind of share kind of what they're doing with people and see those characters come to life and have those things be bigger than just, what you think of, in your studio. Have people actually want to write comics about it, want to dress like the characters, do something different. And it was really satisfying to see the passion that people had for the work that the team had done. And like I said, that was super cool, but it was kind of the end of, a little period for us. So from Dead Space, we kind of moved into the new chapter at Visceral. And back a couple years ago, I was actually on business in Barcelona, Spain, meeting with a bunch of other general managers for the company. And as a general manager, you kind of run a studio, and that's the job I have now. And I met a bunch of different people, and one of the people I met was this guy named Carl Magnus. And he was the general manager for DICE, and DICE was the developer that made the Battlefield series. And we were just having a conversation, and I was telling him how much I loved, Battlefield. I'd played 1942, I played all of them, 2142, Vietnam, played everything, Bad Company. And I was a huge fan, and I was telling him how cool it was that even though they were making Battlefield games, they were able to continue to change the setting and keep it fresh and different. They were jumping around from era to era, and that was really cool. Because with Dead Space, we'd been kind of doing the same thing for 8 years, and we wanted a new challenge. We wanted to try something different, and you couldn't really take Isaac Clarke and stick him in a different setting. It'd just be weird. It wouldn't make sense. So we started talking about another thing that was really neat about Battlefield, which is the setting can change, but the core gameplay has been kind of the same. It's been this great rock, paper, scissors combination that has been really great for the multiplayer. So we just started talking about what would be cool to change, or how you could do it differently. And we started talking about cops and robbers, and how the war on the streets would be a cool concept for a video game. And Coem laughed and said, you know what, we'd actually talked about that ourselves at DICE. That's something that we were pretty excited about. Would you guys like to make a game like that with Battlefield? He really liked Dead Space. He thought our studio was really talented. And I said, yeah, that'd actually be super cool if you're serious. And so before we did that, we both decided it was important that we actually knew how to make that game. Because you can't just go from a Dead Space game to making a Battlefield game, because they're totally different. So we had to learn a new technology base, which is the Frostbite engine. And we decided that we would help and take on one of the expansion packs for Battlefield 3, which was the Endgame expansion. So the team at Visceral and I worked on Endgame, and that introduced motorcycles into the franchise, air superiority, some other game modes. And that was really satisfying because we'd shown everybody in the company that we could actually make Battlefield stuff. And so that was exciting, and at that point we decided, all right, let's do this cops and robbers game. Let's make this Battlefield Hardline thing. So fast forwarding today, here we are at EGX, and we've announced the game, we showed it off at E3, we had Gamescom that was really fun, but here at EGX on the show floor, you're going to be able to play a new mode called Hotwire, which is all about taking over and controlling vehicles. And it's really trying to lean into that idea of the getaway. If you think about movies about cops and robbers, you always see them racing around in hot rods, the cops chasing the criminals. So the design team came up with this really fun mode that is very similar in some ways to like a mobile conquest. And what's cool, I think, is that you guys can play it today if you want to. It's out on the show floor, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. Because at the studio, one thing that we're really focused on doing is listening to the community feedback coming from people. When we announced the beta, we did it for a reason, because we wanted to hear what our actual players thought about the game, so we could take that feedback and incorporate it into the game. So we've been spending a lot of time on Twitter, on various blogs, trying to interact with you guys. So if you have a minute today, go over and try Hotwire out and let us know what you think, because it makes a difference hearing what the community thinks about what we're doing. So that's it for my presentation. That's a picture of me when I was about 4 or something. I just wanted to say thanks a lot. It's been really cool here talking with you all, and I hope it was interesting listening to me share my story. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at the Hotwire game mode in this trailer.
Peggy 18.
Reported. Assistance requested. Respond quickly.
Thanks very much, Steve. I do remember Majestic, by the way. That was a very, very cool concept. Okay, we've just got time to take a couple of questions. We're going to bring some mics into the aisle, or aisles. So if you would like to come and queue up behind the mics, if you want to ask Steve a question.
No questions.
Any questions? Here we go.
Hello. So my question is that you said when you used to play like Dungeons and Dragons and that was your start of it, and then you went on to develop things like Legacy of Kain and that sort of thing. I'd be really interested to know if you actually go back and play those games for either reflection or nostalgia, or for pure gameplay. Do you go back to the old school for inspiration for the new school, if you like?
Well, I definitely will look at older games from time to time, not necessarily the things that I've worked on, because I've played them a ton. But yeah, I mean, when we were working on PlayStation 2 games, for instance, I looked at a lot of Super Nintendo games and PlayStation 1 games, because there's great ideas, you know, nuggets of concepts and things that were cool that maybe didn't catch on or maybe weren't implemented the best way in a particular game, and look at that for inspiration and things that we could maybe build off of and make better.
Okay, cool, thanks.
How you doing? Question is about Hardlines. The trailers that have been shown, there's a kind of element of story mode going through it, and with Battlefield being corely based on online play, and with Battlefield 4's kind of story mode being seen as an extended tutorial really to ease you into the game, how's the story mode going to fit into Hardline and the kind of overall arc, i.e. is it just a standalone story mode, i.e. an extended tutorial sort of thing, just to get you into the meat, or is it going to have like a fundamental basing on maybe missions and stuff based within the actual multiplayer?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things that, you know, our studio has been focused on for many years is delivering a single-player campaign in the games that we make. So it's really important to us that we not only deliver an awesome multiplayer, but that we do something different and innovative and fresh for the franchise. So our single-player campaign is a full-fledged campaign that is going to feature, you know, an entire storyline with new characters, with more of a TV-style presentation, and new mechanics that you haven't experienced in Battlefield before. We're going to allow players to go through the game as in a variety of different ways, focused on player choice. So if you're the kind of player that wants to be more sneaky and play stealthily, you can do that. If you want to go through the game, you know, working as a cop and taking enemies down non-lethally by pulling out your badge and arresting them, you can do that. Or if you're the kind of player that just wants to play run and gun and run right through it and just shoot everybody as you please, you can do that too. We're really focused on making sure that the single player is different and lets people have player choice. It's important for us.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
Hi there. In all the Battlefield trailers, everyone always thinks, oh wow, this looks amazing, but how do you like try and transition that into the multiplayer? Because you think, oh well, it's going to play out like this, but it never does. Like in the beta, everyone was saying, it doesn't really look like the trailer.
So I think, you know, creating a trailer versus just streaming one perspective of a player is very different, right? So when you're playing the game, you're only seeing your viewpoint. But if you think about our trailers, it's more like you're zooming the camera out and looking at a bunch of players playing it. So it's more from like a spectator's perspective. And I think that's where people kind of sometimes can get that disconnect, because they see the trailer and they go, that's not what it looks like. But you got to remember, you're only seeing the game as you play it from one perspective. You don't know what it looks like from the other player's perspective. You don't know what it looks like when I'm standing over here. So I think that's kind of a disconnect. But I think ultimately, what's important is that the game's fun and that you have those moments that you feel a rush and you feel exhilarated because you pulled off an awesome move. I think that's what's really important.
Cheers, thank you.
You bet.
Okay, well, sadly, that's all we have time for. So please do join us for more sessions again tomorrow. And for now, thank you very much to Steve from Visceral.
Thank you.